Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 113 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Foreign Policy Focus is the podcast where I discuss current events and foreign policy and international news and then give analysis on those events and issues. The show can be found at the libertarianinstitute.org on the homepage underneath the Scott Horton Show, at the show's page foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or at the Facebook page Kyle's Files. Well, I usually have bad news to bring everyone. Today's bad news is worse than usual, and that is what I have been talking about every episode for the past probably 2 weeks, and that is House Concurrent Resolution 81, which was a bill that was brought forward and then it actually ended up being co-sponsored by, I believe, about 40 representatives now, that was meant to invoke the War Powers Act to end the United States war assisting Saudi Arabia in Yemen. Now, as I have discussed several times on the show, and I'm not going to get into again on this episode, but the war that Saudi Arabia is waging against Yemen is absolutely brutal, nasty, and is getting to the point where it's causing a genocide. Up to 1 million people this year will contract cholera. Nasser Arabi, I think, was estimating that every 10 minutes a child is dying of cholera in Yemen. We have half the country starving and then like a quarter of the country at the point where they're starving to death. You have Saudi Arabia just absolutely devastating the people of Yemen with airstrikes. We had again 29 people killed in a market when Saudi Arabia hit a bunch of civilians with an airstrike there. And so what this resolution would have done is it would have ended now that. And the advantage of this resolution is because it was invoking the War Powers Act, is it was a privileged resolution or bill. What that meant is that it was supposed to have to come to the floor for a vote. What happened was that the House Rules Committee stripped the bill of its privilege, meaning that it no longer has to come up for a vote. Now, I believe there was a tiny victory in that there will be a debate on the bill, but as far as it goes, it doesn't look like we're going to make any progress, at least through the legislature, ending the war in Yemen. And while this is terrible news, reflecting on the past few weeks and then looking at what's happened, of just the general awareness, at least of our representatives of the war in Yemen, has, I think, absolutely been huge. Cobbling together nearly 10% of representatives to co-sponsor a bill that would actually end a U.S. intervention in Saudi Arabia, and a pretty critical one at that. Remember, this is hacking at the United States-Saudi relationship, which of course to all those bought off by the arms dealers would be an absolutely huge blow. And so I do think this was important. I do think we made some progress. I give a ton of credit to Scott Horton, who put together this awesome activism where he was giving away a lifetime subscription to Listen and Think Audio in exchange for people just calling the representative and begging them to, or trying to convince them at least to, so co-sponsor and support this motion. So huge shout out to Scott Horton and the guys that Listen and Think Audio. That was a real chance. It was a real big thing that they did, and hopefully it helps. Hopefully it does end up making some difference in the end of this, and one day the United States will stop killing Yemenis before they're all gone. We got a few new news updates on the New York terror attack. I believe the death count is still 8, and it does look like that the survivors, I think there were 4 in critical condition, but the others were pretty well off, and so that looked okay. The attacker himself looks like he will actually survive this, which, like I said, is surprising. I really, it is very uncommon that this happens. Most of the time, the attackers end up either having suicide vests or weapons and shooting their way out of it. Amazing restraint, I guess, shown by the New York police force that the officers didn't just end up executing this guy, which is kind of what you think may happen as well. But he ends up alive, so he's going to be able to stand trial. Now, the first thing is no Guantanamo Bay. That was something that Trump had floated in the immediate aftermath. I'm sure he was a little hot under the collar, but it kind of came down to that there was too much legal proceedings and hurdles to clear to send him to Gitmo, and it would be easier just to conduct the trial this way. Now, the Trump administration is pushing for the death penalty in this case. I'm guessing it's going to be a federal case, and it's going to be on terrorism charges, so that would mean, I guess, that they could go after the death penalty. Not sure exactly what, how this is all going to play out and what the morality standard for everything is. However, this is a terrible case. And one of the things more related to foreign policy in this show that I could talk about is that all these articles I'm seeing of all these people going, why are there so many Uzbeki terrorists, and why are all the terrorists coming from Uzbekistan? And pretending like all the terrorists forever have come from Uzbekistan, which isn't the case. I mean, if you look at the numbers of people who have joined ISIS, topping the list are the, typical Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. And so it is kind of a wonder how all these publications get away with this, but I find it interesting that for the first time, really, they're focusing on where the guy came from. Now, when it's a Libyan who goes and kills people, or a Syrian, or a Saudi, or Emirati, or an Egyptian, nobody says a word, and I think there's two reasons. In some of the cases, it's because it makes a blowback argument too obvious. If it's a Libyan guy who goes out and kills a bunch of people, or if it's a Syrian or an Iraqi or an Afghani, well, then you point and say he probably did this because of the United States interventionism in his country. In cases like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE or Qatar, maybe, I would guess the reason that the United States doesn't want to highlight this is because then we will, that they'll really have to address the Sunni Shia problem and how the United States foreign policy plays into it. As I've discussed on the show several times, one of the things that doesn't make sense is that if the United States interventionism is, let's say, what it's trying to pretend like it wants to do, and that is to shape the world in a way to make it safe and prosperous for Americans, then, supporting Saudi Arabia isn't necessarily the thing we want to do because, of course, Saudi Arabia, like our other allies, Turkey, UAE, Qatar, and Egypt, all support the Sunni terrorists, while our enemies like Iran, Hezbollah, or the Houthis in Yemen, they're all fighting against the terrorists. And so it's a real head scratcher as to, how the U.S. foreign policy ends up being what it is. But I think the United States media and just writers in general are trying to take advantage of this one because the United States hasn't bombed Uzbekistan and no Americans really know anything about the country. And in fact, probably couldn't find on a map. And hell, there's probably a chunk of them that didn't even know the thing existed. It will be interesting to see as time goes on what this guy gives his reasons for. Apparently he was asking for an ISIS flag in his room. I don't think there's any real evidence that the Middle East ISIS, what's left of the dying caliphate, was in any way had a hand in this, and that this was a lone wolf attack. And other than maybe the guy watching some propaganda videos put out by the Islamic State or something like that, this was pretty much just a lone wolf kind of thing. News from North Korea. We have the South Korean president saying that his country will not host or develop nuclear weapons. Of course, not only is this kind of a problem for the Trump administration, which at least has been hinting at the idea of putting nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula, it's also a problem for some of the foreign policy realists, some people who I absolutely respect their opinion, maybe like a Doug Bandow type who suggests that the United States should pull out of South Korea and allow the South Koreans to develop their own nuclear weapons to counter North Korea. I think this is one of the problems that the United States has in North Korea, is that we've created such a monster by threatening Kim Jong-un and the North Koreans for all these years that they ended up developing hydrogen bombs. And now, if left be alone, well, there may be some balance of power realigning to do, kind of like we see in the Middle East, that whenever the United States pulls out, that we built the enemies up so big that they're able to hurt other people. We also have an announcement that there is still a diplomatic channel, I think it's known as the New York channel, that's open between the United States and North Korea. This is a good sign, and while the media only likes to focus on the bombing part and the idea that Trump, is tweeting out these ridiculous things about North Korea, at the end of the day, there is Rex Tillerson, hopefully, and some intelligent people at the State Department, and, God forbid, not Nikki Haley, are working to having some kind of peaceful resolution with the North Koreans. However, as far down as this road we are, there's a lot of people that are now predicting some pretty dire things to happen between the United States and North Korea. And it may take a real, miracle of diplomacy to have a good outcome here. A couple interesting stories dealing with social media that I've read. The first is that apparently Twitter hit 48% of the hashtag DNC tweets that were tweeted out when the DNC leaks were going on. Of course, the DNC leaks were emails that were not hacked, but downloaded off of the DNC server and then leaked to WikiLeaks, who then put out all those emails for the rest of us to read, and revealed that Donna Brazile gave the debate questions to Hillary Clinton and really told, I think most importantly, the Democratic voters that the Democratic primary from the 2016 that ended up nominating Hillary Clinton was completely bogus and 100% against Bernie Sanders. Another interesting thing is that we have Facebook and YouTube who have started to kind of go through, and whenever there's images that are reported as being too graphic, they will delete them. Now, while some people may say, oh, I can see the point there, the problem is that there's a lot of people in the world now who have smartphones and that live in the Middle East. And when their village is bombed, they really don't have a way maybe to get justice or to even identify and correctly bury the dead and let the international community know that, hey, either Russia, the United States, Syria, Iran, whoever, Saudi Arabia in the Middle East bombed these people and now they're dead and look, here are the dead bodies. However, they are able to do that by posting either pictures or videos on Facebook and YouTube. And when they delete that content, a lot of times the content's gone because, you know, if you're living either in ISIS-controlled territory or I'm sure even in territory controlled by the Iraqi or Syrian government, it could be very dangerous to possess any kind of information that could possibly hurt those regimes. And so the removal of that content is sometimes destroying the only proof of war crimes. And you know, talking about war crimes, these aren't houses being burned or people, you know, marched at gunpoint, but people being dismembered and, you know, killed by bombs falling out of the sky. In a bit of good news, I guess, we have Boris Johnson, who is a higher ranking UK politician. I'm not all up on my UK politics, to be quite honest with all of you, but Boris Johnson is kind of a figure whose name I see in the media awful lot, so I figure it must carry some weight. He's coming to the United States to talk to our Senate about keeping the United States within the Iran nuclear agreement and not amending it or putting on additional sanctions. That, you know, great thing. Hopefully he taught some sense to the Americans. Although I'm sure this will mostly just lead to mocking from Trump and, you know, generally no benefit or no gain on our half. One of the most disastrous things we have going on right now is the fear mongering against the Iranians that the war state is really pushing. Their latest kind of attack on Iran is this release of documents that were apparently at the Bin Laden headquarters where Bin Laden was killed in Pakistan. And one of these documents was a 19-page unnamed report, but they allege it was written by a senior al-Qaeda official that highlights ties between Iran and al-Qaeda and basically painting out Iran out to be an ally of al-Qaeda. Now, for those of you who have, you know, a radar for telling when you're being lied to by the establishment or the deep state or the mainstream media, it's certainly set off when you read something like this. This seems like Iraq War II level Saddam has mass destruction level deception right here, you know, kind of the Russiagate type of thing almost, where you'll have a bending of the truth and complete falsification of information. Moon of Alabama, which is a great blog that really dives into a lot of the stuff that goes on in foreign policy and the Middle East, goes through and says, we don't think this is a legitimate document. It doesn't have a name on it. There's several things in this document that are just wrong, like factual inconsistencies, claiming events that happened didn't happen the way, you know, the document claimed. One of the big claims that Moon of Alabama attaches is this idea that for some reason al-Qaeda was training with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Of course, you know, definitely not the case at all. Hezbollah in southern Lebanon look at what they're doing. They're fighting for Assad against the jihadists all over Syria, not just ISIS, but also the al-Qaeda guys that America has armed to such a great extent. And then I read a Gareth Porter article dating way back, I believe May or March of 2012, when he goes through and says this claim that is always brought up by the war party, this idea that Iran somehow, I guess, sheltered and hid al-Qaeda terrorists from the United States after 9/11 is completely false. In fact, if you look at the timeline, what the Iranians apparently were doing was holding them as hostages. And so, if on 9/11, let's say, there were some Muslim terrorists in the United States jails, I think the guy who tried to bomb the Trade Center in 1993 was actually in a U.S. jail at the time. And you said, look, there's al-Qaeda linked terrorists in the United States. Well, this would, this is a laughable statement. These people were basically under house arrest in Iran. And in fact, at one point, they traded them to the al-Qaeda for an Iranian diplomat. Now, this might also be something that, the United States or Donald Trump will find upsetting. However, the Americans traded Bill Bergdahl for some terrorists. Of course, his case, I guess, just came to a conclusion. He will not face jail time, but will be dishonorably discharged from the army. I'm not quite sure exactly what happened with the Bergdahl thing. I gotta be honest, that just wasn't a story I paid a whole lot of attention to at the time it was coming out. I thought from both sides it was more just pandering than any actual facts. Now that it's all said and done, there may be some good articles printed or stories about it, and if I read it, maybe I'll bring that to you. In Catalonia, with the independence movement, we had the president of Catalonia remaining in Belgium saying that he's going to be there until it's safe for him to leave. He's not looking for asylum or abandoning the Catalonians. But I think he has the understanding that if he goes and rots away in a Spanish prison, it's going to do him absolutely no good. The vice president of Catalonia and several cabinet members who remained in Catalonia and then went and stood court in, trial in Spain, were given prison with no bond and could be held there up to 4 years, and then I believe are facing like 35 years each. It's a very grim picture for them, and unless there's some kind of freedom movement and independence of Catalonia, these people may never see the light of day. Some of them in their upper years. So, very disappointing. Hopefully some European countries start to realize what Catalonia or what Spain is doing to Catalonia and will come to the aid of these people just looking to rule themselves. Interesting story out of Pakistan. We had a woman, it seemed like a woman who was probably in some kind of arranged or a forced marriage, attempting to kill her husband by poisoning his milk and ended up accidentally killing 17 people in total. Very bad news out of Niger, where we had the Niger government announcing that they will allow armed U.S. drones in Niger, and I guess this means that the United States could carry out armed drone strikes against targets in Niger. This likely means we will see Trump surpass Obama, bombing an 8th country sometime relatively soon. In Niger, we also have the government saying that they weren't, 100% in alignment with the United States story on what happened to the Green Berets there. Of course, the official story that was put out by General Dumford in the U.S. was that the Green Berets were there on a training mission. I guess they were meeting with some local tribal officials and then were ambushed. According to the Niger government, that happened, but then it turned into a raid against ISIS targets, and that's when they were attacked. This would change things an awful lot and would be a real problem for the Trump administration, because this would be a, kind of an act of war without any Congress authorization for war. On the Iraqi border, we have Turkey squaring off with the Syrian PKK, or the Turkish PKK group. The PKK is a group of Kurds who do not see eye to eye with the Iraqi Kurds, the Kurdish regional government there. They have different political beliefs and values, but they are aligned with the Syrian YPG and operate in northern Iraq, Turkey, and northern Syria. In the firefight, 25 were killed. Most of those dead were PKK, but I think a total of 8 Turkish soldiers were also killed. The news out of Syria is that the Syrian government announces the official liberation of Deir ez-Zor. They continue to move south along the Euphrates River as the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic forces move south along the Euphrates River on the other bank. ISIS continues to lose a lot of ground in both Syria and Iraq, and the caliphate is, pretty much absolutely destroyed. I do plan on doing an episode sometime in the next few weeks on the rise and fall of ISIS and kind of going over, what happened. This is going to be a weird chapter in history where suddenly between 2014 and 2017, there's an Islamic caliphate in the Levant. In north central Turkey, right in the Aleppo province and right on the edge of the city of Aleppo, we have the Turkish enclave of Afrin. This also borders the Idlib province, and it looks like Turkey is doing the best they can to surround this province to surround this Turkish enclave in order to kill as many Kurds as possible and take it from them. Of course, Turkey has long insisted that there should not be any Kurds west of the Euphrates River. We also have Israel carrying out airstrikes on a Syrian weapons depot in the Homs province, and then the Syrian government launching surface-to-air missiles against the Israeli plane. Israel reported none of their planes were hit. Alright, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for the week. I hope everybody enjoyed it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org, Kyle's Files on Facebook, or the Libertarian Union on Facebook. The Libertarian Union is a great new project that I'm a part of, where myself and several other podcast hosts who have really cool shows. I highly recommend everybody check it out. It's the Actual Anarchy. Kenny the Wizard has his podcast on there. We used to do a show together, the Weekly Freedom File, so, check out his work. He's great. And several other great podcasts. Maybe I'll try to have a few of those guys on the show, where it fits in, where they could talk about foreign policy and we could, chat about the happenings and whatever. Twitter at KYAALE. My personal website is kylesfilesblog.com. I do a daily news roundup that can be found, Facebook, Libertarian Institute, wherever you want to look for it. A lot of people like that, so I really recommend you all check that out. And that'll do it.